Okay, part four. Part four, says Monica. Part four. All right. So the last, just to finish this up, the last little interesting thing that was announced just at the start of the Bonn meeting of COP23 was this release of the fourth so-called National Climate Assessment. This was required by a law that we passed in the U.S., a federal law in 1990, that said periodically all of the science that's either done by U.S. government, federal agencies, or is from work funded by those agencies. This is not a literature review necessarily. This is a just pulling together all the stuff and where are we? What do we know about the situation? Again, a scientific document, objective, meant to help guide elected representatives, policymakers, etc. With stuff. And so this was this was big news a few weeks ago when this was released, and got all kinds of attention. Most of the stuff that you heard spoken in these things was by the four people in this group of hundreds of folks that were non-federal employees that were on the group. All the federal employees were banned from speaking to the media about this. So you'll see the same names popping up over again and again. You'll hear NGO people answering questions because the authors were not allowed to speak to the media. Okay, so just to make sure to wrap up again, in my previous things we've gone through a lot of the basic facts, but we'll just go through this. So the previous National Climate Assessment came out in 2013. That was the third one that we had. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the last IPCC report, which we call an assessment, was the fifth assessment. That also came out in 2013. Since that time, we've compiled a thing called the Coastal Resilience Project for Ventura County, which was funded by the Nature Conservancy, and a bunch of us worked on that. And you guys can look at interactive maps in terms of sea level rise and coastal flooding, specifically in the context of our coastal management discussions. Right here, models specifically designed for Oxnard, Naval Base Ventura County, etc. We released that in 2016. And then just this year, we had the release of the Oxnard's local coastal plan. Again, that was one of the planning tools that we do deal with in coastal zone management, and in our case is overseen / approved by, approved by the Coastal Commission. Oxnard is been working for a while. We've actually had students, some of your predecessors have worked on the original drafts of that, and we have a formal public draft that's been released in I think we had the meeting about 2 months ago. Ventura County in the last few months has released or has started working on adaptation and climate change planning. And then again, just in Bonn, in Bonn in Germany, coinciding with COP23, we released the draft version of the National Climate Assessment. So this is to get public input, as with any good government, stakeholder engagement effort, right? So you guys can provide public feedback if you like. There's various volumes to the report, and they will be accepting feedback for the next many weeks / months, and then that will eventually become the final version of the fourth National Climate Assessment that will be published later in 2018. So what's important to say is this 2017 fourth National Climate Assessment, one, it came out from our federal government at a time when all the other stuff I just talked about happened, so that's kind of interesting. I mean, obviously, working on these documents takes a long time. It's a years-long process. So this was begun before the current folks were in the administration, but still, it's an interesting one. This will be the best document. If you want to quote something about climate change, this is going to be the best document you should quote from, especially for those of us here in the U.S., for the next several years. The next IPCC assessment will not come out until 2022. So this is the most updated, summary of data, updating of models, predictions, all that stuff. I went this morning and grabbed the most recent estimate, and this is our CO2 measurements on the top of the volcano in Hawaii, and we're at 406, almost 407 parts per million in terms of CO2 in the atmosphere. So in terms of the fourth National Climate Assessment, I just want to run through real quick. Again, I know you guys have watched the previous podcasts about what coastal zone and climate change, the coastal zone. We'll just run through some stuff here, then we'll finish up. But I really liked some colleagues last week broke this down, and I basically mirrored what they did about what we've known for a long time, what we've learned more recently, and what we're just now starting to understand in terms of the state of knowledge of global weirding, climate change in this fourth assessment. And so we've known for a long time the global temperature has been going up, not surprising at all. And there are no convincing alternative explanations. So I'll just reiterate, your federal government, the publication of the science from your federal government says there is no convincing alternative explanation other than emissions from burning fossil fuels, human-induced releasing. That's the only thing that explains this changing climate. So that's a fact. And it's important to know that we've been studying this since the 1890s, right? The impression you'll sometimes get under certain, again, folks that are attempting to mislead you will say, oh, the science isn't settled. We need to study it longer. We've been studying this for over a century. To be sure, the intensity of study really started picking up in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. But 1890 was the first published paper on atmospheric releases of emissions and how that affects stuff. Another thing we've known for a long time is that the polar areas, in the context of this national assessment, so this is the U.S. document, in our case that would be Alaska. Alaska is the hot spot for a lot of this change. It should be noted that in the tax bill that just passed the Senate this weekend, if that holds with reconciliation, we're going to allow drilling in the 1002 lands in ANWR. So we're going to be expanding oil and gas extraction in the middle of the porcupine caribou herd calving grounds in Alaska, but that's interesting. What we've learned more recently is how the extremes are changing. So we're learning that the hottest hot days are getting hotter. The days of heat waves, the number of days of consecutively above 100 or 105 are getting more. When we get incredible downloads of rain, those downloads are getting more and more intense, that kind of stuff. As we've been saying for some time, most of the scientists, the modeling that we've been, most of the modeling you guys see comes from the IPCC, or it's down resolved from the IPCC's global models. Those models are extremely conservative. Those are the models that the George W. Bush administration agreed to, the Putin administration, India agreed to, all that stuff. And what we increasingly see is those estimates are way too conservative. So the amount of sea level rise, it's too low. The amount of time it will take for the glaciers to melt it's happening much faster, all those kind of things. Another one, particularly for us, is the so-called atmospheric rivers, like we had last winter, that just dump and dump and dump on us. Those are increasingly the norm as we screw with a jet stream with upper level changes.
So we never, that's something, a new phenomenon?
Well, no, atmospheric rivers are not new phenomenon, but the frequency with which we're seeing them, the intensity of them is increasing. We've more recently just really understood the interplay between the high latitudes and the mid latitudes, and they reinforce each other. Again, most obviously last year with this so-called atmospheric rivers. One thing that's very clear is the amount of rain that's being dumped per hurricane is increasing. There's still some contention as to the frequency and this and that, but definitely the amount of precipitation has become very, very clear. Is per storm event, per extreme storm event, is going way high, and those impacts are being exacerbated by the sea level rise. And then we're just starting to not fully understood, but we're really starting to see is, to put into context, what we're talking about, the IPCC models we've been planning for are about a 1.5 to 3 foot rise in sea level here in the Oxnard Plain. That amount of sea level rise will put the ocean at the edge of Round Mountain over there. What's becoming increasingly clear is it's much, much more likely that we might get 8 foot sea level rise by 2100, which would mean we'd need to dike campus here. Or at least the water be right up to the edge of campus. Depending. Yeah.
Is that supposed to be SLR on the bottom line?
Ooh, right. Yes, sea level rise, not sea rise level. Thank you. Good. The other thing that we're just starting to come to terms with is the magnitude of what we're changing is massive. And we've kind of known that, but what we're really starting to understand is the inertia of the system is probably going to take decades to maybe longer to actually come into equilibrium. So even if we shut off the emissions today, the pendulum is swinging really, really hard. And it's going to take a while for that pendulum to stop swinging. And just most recently in the last couple months, it's become clear that we don't have any analog for this amount of what's going on in the climate in the last 100 million years. So that's a large chunk of time. So all of our society has grown up basically in the last few 100,000 years, really since the agricultural revolution, the last 10,000 years or so. All of our societal things, all of our MPA planning and coastal zone management, all this stuff, really was evolved in a world that we are leaving. And so in terms of predictability of rainfall, in terms of when it's going to be warm, all that stuff is changing. And then just I'm going to end with a couple of the pieces of data that your country paid for and you paid for, and that's in this fourth assessment. This should look fairly common. This is the rise of atmospheric carbon dioxide. As I showed you before, we're above 400 now. And as that number goes up, the sea is the big sponge with all this stuff. So the sea absorbs a lot of this, both the carbon as well as the thermal energy. And that leads to, as you guys know, ocean acidification. The last time we saw CO2 above 400 parts per million was 3 million years ago on planet Earth. Merry Christmas. And at that period, atmospheric temperature and sea level was much higher than it is now. Again, that's what I was telling you. It takes a while for the climate system to come into equilibrium. So that probably took, a couple thousand years or something to really get, to those levels. So we're not immediately going to jump to that level tomorrow, but there's a lot of inertia. And then again, the emission rate that we're seeing in terms of how much carbon is being pumped in the atmosphere, we've not seen that. We've had no analog for that for at least 100 million years. Yeah, so interesting times we're in. Again, this is leading to increased temperature change. And we see this both with our modeling exercises as well as directly observed data. We can do this in a million ways now. We can do this with sea core ice. We can do this with cast-off diatom shells. We can do this in many, many different ways, and we get the same story over and over again from multiple independent sources of paleoclimatology. This is leading, amongst other things, to change surface water oxygenation in our oceans. And so here you see the areas that are the most strongly affected. What you see is the Pacific here, the North Pacific in particular, is one of the areas that's going to see the greatest change. And notice that our California coast is bathed in a fair amount of change in terms of changed surface waters. Here's some illustration of that atmospheric river we're talking about. And so what we're looking at here is the Pacific Basin, and you see that long tongue of hot color. That's essentially a big chunk of wet, moist air that's shooting out from the tropics and is essentially, in the case of these particular events, basically a runway to take tropical moisture and dump it on the west coast of the U.S. in very intense rainfalls. So, the kind of things like we saw in last summer, or excuse me, last winter, and or the kind of stuff we saw with Hurricane Harvey, right? Just really intense rainfall over the course of hours that might be continuous. Not a squall that dumps a bunch for a few minutes and moves on, but just is like being underneath a fire hose for the whole state or the whole southern part of the state or something of that nature. We see increasing persistence of tropical storms and cyclones, what we usually call hurricanes, what we call typhoons. When it's in this part of the Pacific, we call them typhoons. Over here, we call them hurricanes, but it's the same exact phenomenon. And all you need to know is that there's a lot of lines here. There's way more lines over here. So we'll be getting more hurricanes here in Ventura County and everything else. And these are only the category 4 and 5. So these are the strongest of the storms. This falls into the area of we don't quite understand yet, and this is a great place if you guys wanted to provide some speculation or some input. All of this document is available for you to give input. If you think these things are baloney, if you think these things are really interesting, if you think these things have interesting consequences for the stuff you worry about, you can comment on our report. One of these things is this notion of potential tipping points. So when one of these systems changes, it rapidly leads to change throughout other systems. And these are the ones that have been highlighted in the report so far. ENSO events, El Nino events, boreal forests, permafrost, coral reefs, all these things that we worry about. And most of the change most of the modeling suggests that the change is going to tend to, on average, not everywhere, but on average, push us to a drier, hotter world. But of course, there are going to be some areas that get more water and more cooler temperatures and things. Okay, so what to do? So we already talked about this, but just to reiterate, to finish up, you might say, how do our federal agencies that are taking us out of the Paris Accord and taking away the requirements to rebuild Houston with being more resilient to climate change, right? President Trump has eliminated those requirements, so people are not rebuilding more resilient in the after effect of the hurricanes of 2017. So you might ask, how does the federal administration reconcile their positions with this new report, which comes from them? And the answer is they don't. Next question. Again, the popular impression among some of the public is that climate change doesn't matter to me, or there's nothing we can do about it. And the answer is there's lots of stuff we can do, right? Don't be all depressed and mumble, oh my God, life's so hard, it's so depressing. No, that's not acceptable, right? Let's solve this issue, right? We should solve this for us and the folks that don't believe in this. We should solve this for everyone, right? We're in this together. This is a collaborative effort. For folks that might think that climate change isn't real, they're going to be hurt as well. We want everybody to be doing better. And so the short answer is take action. And one of the clear things that this polling stuff has shown us is that we should talk about it more. As challenging as that can be with your Uncle Larry at Christmas dinner, probably need to talk about it. You might need to have a libation or two to steel yourself before the conversation. But the notion is that not talking about this on all sides, is not an effective way to go forward. So also from that Yale stuff, it shows that less than 3/4 of the U.S. population talk about climate change more than twice a year. So most people don't hear about it. They don't think it's going to impact them. It's not a big thing. So part of it is to engage the conversation. Obviously, as with everything we do in ESRM, we want to do this as partners. We don't want to go in and say these people are stupid, because they're not, right? We want to do this as colleagues, right? We want to have an effective dialogue. We want to bring these folks into the conversation. You do that by using language and tone, in particular tone, that is chill, right? We don't be stupid. We don't say these guys are idiots or whatever. Let's talk about it, right? Well, let's talk about it in a way that is with language, with terms, with examples that are relevant to these folks, contextually relevant. So, for example, maybe climate change is not the way to have the conversation. Maybe the way to have the conversation is, do you like wine? Or do you like to go skiing at Mammoth? Or did you hear about the asthma rates in Oxnard or wherever next to the 405? All those things are going to get worse under a warming world. That is usually a much more effective way to engage in conversation than quoting CO2 at the top of Mauna Loa or whatever, right? Water supply, a great one to talk about in our county, right? So do you like to grow strawberries or no? Do you like to grow avocados or no, right? And so, again, to finish up, this is the story that I always tell. And I might have told you guys this story already, or I might have mentioned it in one of my earlier lectures. So if so, I apologize, but I'll just end with this. So a lot of times we have this folks that say silly things like Senator Imhoff that aren't factually correct and stuff. But I like to end with this. These are two of my then neighbors when we moved here. One of these guys is still a good neighbor of mine, good nut, good guy. The other gentleman unfortunately passed away a couple years ago. But this was at a party in our street because we like to party on my street because I'm a professor, dude. But when I moved into our street, many of the folks where we moved had different political views than me, and different thoughts on the subjects that we're talking about today, in particular climate change. And so did I already tell you guys the story?
No.
Okay. So I drive a Prius because again I'm a weird professor, dude, right? And so I drove up and these guys, which are totally good people. These guys are great people. They're not evil or anything like that. But for example, the gentleman on the right, who unfortunately has since passed away, he had a big Escalade, and he was not married. He didn't have a bunch of soccer kids going to play soccer or whatever. And so they would oftentimes rib me about being, you freaking hippie and all that kind of stuff, right? And so this was at one of our parties, and it was a toga party. And so we're talking, and they're like, give me all this stuff, and all these silly things happen. So then, they're giving me stuff about the car I drive, right? And when I first moved in, I had a maxi van, because I've always had vans until we moved here, and then, no, I don't. But anyway, so I had to get rid of my maxi van because I love my wife, apparently. And so don't have my van anymore. So now I drive everywhere in my little Prius. And those guys are always mocking, hey, roller skate, blip, 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 how do you haul a Christmas tree around, blip, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? Haha, you guys are so funny, haha. But about a year or so after this, summertime, I'm driving up my street, and the guy on the right, who has the big Escalade, or had the big Escalade, walks out and goes, hey, Sean. I'm like, hey, man. So I pull over and say, hey, what's up? And say hi and everything. And he says, and he puts his I roll the window down. And he puts his hands on the driver's side or the passenger side window, and he's looking at my Prius and he's kind of nodding his head. He said, so, how many miles per gallon do you get? And what I wanted to say was, what the hell you care about that, dude? Like, really? Instead, I bit my tongue, and I said, well, when I was up at Stanford before we came down here, I was getting like 54 miles per gallon. But now you have to go up the hill and stuff all the time, and so I get more like 45, 44 miles per gallon. And I was ready for him to say like, blah, 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 blah. And instead, he just kept nodding and he goes, so it gets up the hill okay? And I bit my tongue again and I said, yes, it does. Why do you ask? He said, well, kind of think about maybe getting a different car. And I said, really? He said, yeah. And I said, dude, you want to take us for a test drive? Absolutely. You know, all this and that. Told him what wasn't great about the car, what was good about the car, and whatever, right? And so there are many points of dialogue, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to think that it's us versus them. Don't get sucked into that world. Don't fall into that trap. It is only us. It is only us involved in all these coastal and management challenges, right? You have to be the big adult that bites your tongue, right? And even though I know at times you want to say, Grandpa, you idiot, you said for years, da, 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 da," but you do not do that, right? You really don't. Is the goal here to make you feel better for 30 seconds and say, I was right, I was right, I was right? Or is the goal to help our planet and people on this planet and animals and critters on this planet, right? That's the goal. So bite your tongue and have that conversation with your crazy neighbor, with the weird lady down the street, with your weird uncle at Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever, right? And it might not work the first couple times, right? But what people certainly are never going to respond to is you acting arrogantly, you acting that they're stupid, you acting that you know everything, because I don't know everything, we don't know everything, right? And the more you make it easy for people to tune out, it's going to be that much harder. And the folks that are engaged in this active misinformation campaign, they win another year. They get another few months. They get another iteration. So don't be depressed. There's all kinds of opportunities here, you guys. Tons of opportunities. See this as opportunity, not as, oh, woe is us, the end of the world. And so that's my son when he was a little bit younger. And so you guys are the reasons we shouldn't tune out on this. And all these young folks are the reasons why we shouldn't tune out on this, right? It's too easy to fall into these stupid old us versus them models and go into our corners and think that our team, whatever the hell that means, our team is the right team and the other team is the evil team. The only way we're going to get through this is if we're all together on the same team. And so that's my end in talking about climate change, but there's all kinds of cool stuff we can do, and you guys should stay engaged. Yay.
Good old Yosemite.